Recording in progress. Okay, excellent. So I'm Joni Willett. I'm co-director of the Institute of Cornish Studies, and Dr. Duncan Yeates is going to be presenting us his PhD research about John Harris. Duncan is a teacher at Foy River Academy, and I love this story. So Duncan got interested in John Harris through a chance encounter. So he read a book, a Proper Job, Charlie Curnow by Alan Kent. So he read this book. There was a passing reference to John Harris, sparked his interest, and here we go. We have a remarkable body of work about a remarkable person. And a character in Cornish history that it feels really important that we know more about. Okay, so Duncan, when you're ready, over to you if you'd like to get started. And
yeah,
cool,
of
looking
course.
forward to it.
Right. Well, first of all, thank you so much for coming on this sort of very cold January evening. I am delighted to present my research to you. I'm just trying to move a few bars around so I can actually read my own title. So this is this is a talk based around obviously the Cornish minor poet, John Harris. It's called "Poverty's Friends Are Few," which is actually a quote from Harris's own poetry, and I think that theme that the friends of poverty are very few does does ring true throughout the entire presentation, the entire research. You know, this is a man who is deeply impoverished but has a huge commitment to poetry. And I've said the poetry, an extraordinary life of the 19th century Cornish miner John Harris. But I think particularly because an extraordinary is a word that gets overused. But if we take it very literally, you know, extraordinary, I think lots about Harris's story is extraordinary. He's really quite an extraordinary character. So the overview of this talk is that I'm going to be covering the following topics. Firstly, I'm going to be discussing some key events in John Harris's life and give examples from his autobiography. I'm going to place his life in a bit of context. I'm also going to be giving an overview of Harris's corpus, focusing on poems about mining, the natural world, pre-Christian religion, notable local personages, and temperance. So it's going to be sort of a two-part talk, really, focusing initially on Harris's life itself and giving you an idea of the man himself. And I think that context is necessary to an appreciation of the work, because although I think too many 19th century reviewers of Harris kind of say, oh, this is a guy who's really poor and he's a miner and he writes poetry, and isn't that in itself a wonderful thing? That to me diminishes his work. It is helpful to understand what we might call the conditions or the means of production, because in itself it's an interesting story. And I think though I think Harris's work stands up, whoever wrote it, rich, you know, advantaged or disadvantaged, it is a useful thing to be aware of. So John Harris's rustic origins. So John Harris was born in a place called Beleno near Camborne. And what you've got here is what I thought I'd do is, rather than sort of summarize, give you a potted summary of Harris, I'll let the man himself sort of do the talking, really. So these extracts in italics are from one of the last books John Harris published. It may have even been one of the last book, and it's a book called, very simply, My Autobiography. And so I'm using these italics bits just to kind of give you a sense of the man in his own words. So John Harris was born in 1820 and he passed away in 1884. He was born in a place called Beleno near Camborne, and in his own words, the place of my birth was a boulder-built cottage with reedy roof, bare rafters and clay floor, locally known as Six Chimneys, on the top of Beleno Hill, Camborne, Cornwall, where I first saw the light on Saturday, October 14th, 1820. The rough house had no back door, not any windows looking northward, except one about a foot square little pantry. But on the south side, it had 4 windows and a porch of primitive granite, literally small, unpolished boulders. The woodwork on the roof was all visible, and sometimes the stars through the thatch. So it does bring a whole new sort of meaning to the phrase, doesn't it? Bringing the outside in, because Harris essentially can see the stars through the thatch in the roof. The walls of his house are kind of, you know, populated with small unpolished boulders. I mean, there's rustic and there's rustic. The house that he lived in, known as Six Chimneys, actually is still standing, although I've never actually been to it because the people that live there guard their privacy quite fiercely, and I've never really been there, but it does still stand. It's kind of, I think, a really important thing to understand about Harris, and it kind of links up with the fundamental theme of what I'm talking about, is that he is born into extreme rural poverty. And if we sort of look at Veleno here, you can sort of see, this is a, you know, not a brilliant screen grab, but it's a really rural place, and it still is. It's sort of, if you look on the map there, there's sort of, it's sort of nearish Troon, and then kind of Beacon and Camborne are near it as well. But when Harris, you know, I mean, it was a really, really rural place. And so, you know, it was not a hotbed of literary activity. It was basically a place full of rural working people. And I think it does make Harris's, you know, I won't quite call it rise to poetic fame, but like Harris's poetic career, even more interesting. You know, he is born into, I would use the word insuperable, really, insuperable rural poverty. As he tells us, he's born into a labouring class family, you know, and these people, and I use the word labouring class, and you could use working class, that's the phrase I've chosen to use. And this labouring class family were all either agricultural workers or miners. I mean, and I think what's, you know, fascinating about John Harris is, you know, he's not born into an advantaged situation in any way, you know, and his family, he goes into quite a lot of detail about them, and he's at pains to state this fact. They're, you know, they're highly religious people, with, you know, quite an abiding deep faith. And then, you know, the house contains very few books at all. I think he talks about the fact that he managed to find one ragged copy of Robinson Crusoe, which is probably one of the most popular novels of the sort of, you know, late 18th century, in the house. So he's really not in a position where he has a lot of advantages. But despite all this, he says, you know, my first attempts at rhyme were made whilst I was a scholar under my one-legged minor master. So, you know, Harris did receive some elementary schooling at the age of 9. And, you know, he talks about these verses that he writes on the blank space of his first ciphering book. And this is the line I think just sums Harris up for me in so many ways. He says, having discovered the secret of rhyme and the mystery of inventing couplets, I found it impossible to stop. And I think those words are fascinating because, you know, the secret of rhyme and the mystery of inventing couplets. And Harris kind of cast this, and Harris is quite an imaginative, he's a poet, isn't he? But he is very imaginative, and he's quite sometimes fanciful in how he describes things. But I think for Harris, you know, it is the secret of rhyme. It is the mystery of inventing couplets. You know, this is like arcane knowledge for a working man, you know. And I think that, you know, you really do kind of feel that about poetry for him. It's something that he's almost intoxicated by and can't quite believe he's able to do. You know, a lot of Harris's work is inspired by the natural world, and it's quite interesting that he does tend to romanticize a lot of his surroundings. And before I read this quote, it's interesting to think that, you know, where Harris worked would have been quite despoiled by mining works. You know, there would have been lots of sort of heaps of rubble and damage, and the kind of romanticized notion of tin mines we've got now because they've decayed and nature's reclaimed them wasn't what Harris would have experienced. I think the academic Shelley Trasker talks a bit about this, that the Cornwall of the 19th century, particularly where mining works go on, is a bit of a dump in places. It's not all beautiful, you know, like these phrases that we now associate with Cornwall, the delectable duchy, you know, wonderful Cornwall, and certain towns are billed as being beautiful. And, you know, what Harris would have seen was quite a lot of despoiled landscape from mining works, but you never ever see that in the writing. It always celebrates the natural world in its organic beauty rather than the industrial damage that's done to it. I mean, this is you know, and this is another example from Harris's autobiography where he talks about drawing direct poetic inspiration from his surroundings. So he says, so strangely did the power of composition assail me, that I would leave my companions at their pleasant games and steal away to my favourite bower, where I sat alone among the heather till the twilight deepened, and the weird boulders caught the glitter of the stars and the music of the evening winds. On my right hand, the 9 maidens stood motionless on the moor, and on my left were the druid relics, rock basins, and ancient castle of Cambrai. Before me were green fields and tree-covered hamlets. Behind me, the rugged rifts of the Land's End. Now, either Harris has got extraordinary eyesight, or he's obviously romanticising a little bit, or imagining what's around him. But, you know, you do get the sense of a man very, very, he's an interesting composite, because he's very attuned to landscape, but I think the landscape he writes about is a highly romanticized version of the organic landscape in terms of what he would have experienced. And one thing I'll come back to later in this presentation is his reference to the Druid relics and the ancient castle of Cambrai, because I think romanticizing things is one of Harris's sort of stock in trade, really. We'll talk about his long verse poem Luda later on, which was inspired by the works of the antiquarian William Borlase, but he definitely does romanticize a natural landscape, and that is a large feature of his work. So here's an example, you know, Cambrai Castle. This was originally built as a chapel in 1379, thought to be dedicated to St. Michael. The castle was extensively built in later periods, primarily in the 18th century, by the Bassett family as a hunting lodge. And this is, you know, this is Harris's castle that he bases one of his long verse poems around. And apparently it's considered a folly because it's built on uncut boulders. But I think this castle to me is quite central to our understanding of Harris and the kind of romanticization project that you get from Harris. You know, this is essentially a hunting lodge, maybe a chapel converted into a hunting lodge. And for Harris, it's a castle. And Cambrai, if you've ever been there, is essentially a hill. But for Harris, it's kind of a mountain. And, you know, William Borlase talks about the evidence of Druid sacrifice on the top of Cambrai, which essentially most scholars agree he has made up. And Harris sort of invests this whole thing, this kind of rather romantic / Gothic beauty. And I think that's a very typical feature of its work. It's highly imaginative. You know, if you read a Harris poem and then go to the place, you might be a little disappointed. So, right, I'll keep the wrong thing there. Right, excuse me. Right, what have I done? Right, going down the mine. So, Harris had worked on the surface of mining work since he was 9. So Harris is sort of schooled from the age of, you know, obviously, I don't know exactly when he goes to school, but he's in school until the age of 9. Never makes it clear. And after the age of 9, he sort of works as what's called a tributor. So he's outside the mines doing other work. And that work is just simply so he talks about his first job, and he basically says, my pay was that I had lunch, that I was given some food. And he worked, you know, long hours sort of doing things. But at the age of 13, his father takes him underground. And he describes that as follows. So I think this is quite telling when we sort of think about what the experience of mining might have been like for the average person. And I think Harris, though, and this is also interesting. So if we consider Harris as someone I've just kind of talked very heavily, quite extensive about Harris is very much like romanticizing the natural landscape. He's also, on one level, a very pragmatic working man. And I think this is quite a tellingly non-pathetic and unemotional description of his experiences of first going into a mine. My father took me with him into the interior of the earth, nearly 200 fathoms under the surface. Ascending and descending the ladders, some 60, 70 in number, was a fearful task. On my first descent into the mine, when I was about 13 years of age, my father went before with a rope fastened to his waist, the other end of which was attached to my trembling self. If my hands and feet slipped from the rounds of the ladder, perhaps my father might catch me, or the sudden jerk might pull us both into the darkness to be bruised to death on the rocks. Sometimes the ladder went down to the middle of a huge cavern, warping and shaking at every step. And with a candle stuck to my hat crown, I could not see from side to side. Sometimes they slanted one way, sometimes another. And sometimes we had to climb over craggy rocks crashed into the void, where a slip of the foot would be our doom. And I think if you look at that, I mean, that's an incredibly pragmatic description of essentially, you know, life-threatening work. I mean, a slip of the foot would be our doom is the only vaguely emotive line in that. This is the mine he's talking about, Dulcoath Mine. This was dubbed the Queen of Cornish mines, and Dulcoath was originally a copper mine and with an output over 350,000 tonnes. It was the 5th largest producer in Cornwall and Devon. And yet the 67 years between 1853 and 1920 saw it yield the largest output of any Cornish mine of black tin, over 100,000 tons. So, you know, he was working in a big place. And yeah, it was obviously a massive industry for Cornwall. And obviously what not everybody who's not an indigenous Cornish person may know is that, you know, Redruth and Campbell were once incredibly affluent places, you know, and you know, if you go to like Clinton Road in Redruth, there's all the mining captains' houses stretched along it. And, you know, and it's interesting now those areas have fallen into not necessarily, you know, into a relative decline, there's a lot of money put into regenerating them. So the thing about Harris that I find the most inspirational on a personal level is that he is completely dedicated to self-improvement. And we sort of talk about, you know, autodidacts, and we sort of talk about it, you know, but, you know, Harris takes it to the next level. You know, he leaves school at the age of 9. That's it. You know, that's his education, the formal education he has. And he details his various teachers, none of whom sound like they sound fine, but they're not supremely qualified people. You know, this is an era where education is becoming mandatory in some form. There's no, you know, I think, is it Matthew Arnold is the first kind of, in speech marks, member of Ofsted, but obviously Arnold is kind of in this era, but I think he follows Harris slightly. And, you know, there's no real quality assurance of what education Harris receives. But after the age of 9, he just takes upon himself to completely educate himself while working incredibly long hours as a miner with very little time, because he's got a deep abiding faith. As well as being a miner, he's also a lay preacher. So he spends all his time doing all these things, and yet he still finds time to try and make himself more and more educated, erudite, and literate. And I thought this is such a lovely sort of piece of, you know, it's quite inspiring when, you know, and it makes you realize how little maybe in modern era we value education and we value experts and people who know anything. Whenever I met with words I did not understand, I referred to my dictionary, which I bought of a pious blacksmith in the mine, to whom I sometimes recited my pieces. So Harris is writing work at this point. For 2 half-crowns, wrote them on a slip of paper, which I carried in my pocket, and learnt them while I travelled to and from my work. In this way, I made a long list of useful syllables of my own, which served me ever afterwards. So, you know, this is a guy that thinks, well, you know, I'm not just going to enjoy the walk to work. Let's maximize my learning time. And he actually spends his time making himself more erudite, more literate, more knowledgeable. And at this time, he's still writing poetry, you know, and I just think that's an extraordinary commitment to self-improvement. And I think if you know anything of the 19th century, you'll know that is a sort of recurring theme, self-improvement. I think one of the biggest selling books, I think, of the Victorian era, one of the most popular books up in the Bible, was a book called Self-Help by a guy called Samuel Smiles. I doubt that was his real name. I'd have to check. I'm not sure he was really called Samuel Smiles. But Samuel Smiles talks, you know, incessantly about the need to develop oneself. And so this kind of ethos of self-improvement and self-development, it's definitely there in the Victorian era. But I think you could say, to use a modern day kind of metaphor, Harris has got it on steroids. You know, he's just absolutely determined to improve himself. So, and I think this is something me and Joni were talking about right at the start. And I think it's kind of really hard, particularly for people who are what I think is the sociological term, digital natives. You know, people who've not grown up with people who've not grown up, people who've grown up with the internet don't quite appreciate, you know, how challenging it could be to source a book. Even in the 80s and 90s, I can remember being interested in certain authors and struggling to buy those books. But now, you know, if I want to read the works of Lord Byron, I can pick up my phone, type in the complete works of Lord Byron. He's out of copyright. I can download a 500-page PDF, and if I can read off a screen, which I struggle to do, but it's how I can read all of Byron's works just like that. But if you contrast that with Harris, you know, books were expensive. Not everyone was literate, and there was a massive class divide. You know, literary pursuits were a middle class endeavor. They weren't for the working man. And I think this little extract from his biography is so telling. So the Reverend Bull is actually very supportive of Harris, but even so, this operates within such a strict class paradigm. The Rev G.T. Bull of Treslothan, seeing I was fond of poetry, lent me a volume of Shakespeare. Yes, that is spelt like that. Harris always spells Shakespeare that way. I think it's because Shakespeare spells his name in many different ways. The first play I read was Romeo and Juliet, which I greedily devoured, travelling over a wide downs near my father's house. The delight I experienced is beyond words to describe, as the sun sank behind the western waters and the purple clouds of evening fringed the horizon. In the lovely home of Mrs. Thomas, I first heard Mr. Ball read some choice extracts from Byron's Childe Harold. The masterly might of this powerful magician held me entranced. For weeks and months, I could hear or think of nothing else. To borrow the book and read it for myself, what a treat. But nobody would think of lending it to me. And, you know, I find that awfully sad. Well, we are, and we have Matthew Arnold talking about, I think, I've forgotten where he mentions it now, but Matthew Arnold writes about how, one of his pieces of work that he talks about how, you can elevate people via literature. It elevates people. It can, and yet, Harris is friends with this guy, and he feels like ignored by him. It's not perceived to be appropriate for him. And there may be many reasons for that. I mean, Byron's reputation was obviously not great, and Harris is criticised. There's a great anecdote where he's outside his house. I haven't included it in the presentation, but he's outside his house and he's reading some Burns, and he retells this anecdote, I think, with his tongue in his cheek. And Harris is quite a stern character in prose. You kind of don't get a feeling that there's much banter with him, but he says something like, he's outside his house reading Burns, and this local lady, she sounds a bit officious, comes up to him and says, "You should be ashamed of yourself." And he said, "Well, why?" And she said, "You, a local preacher, and reading Burns." And the idea that Burns is a bit too salacious for the local preacher to be reading because of his reputation. And I wonder that maybe that's why the Reverend Ball was so reluctant to lend Harris Byron, because of, and obviously if you know your Byron, you know that Childe Harold is the epitome of the Byronic hero. He's an amoral, antagonistic, problematic character. And maybe that, and I can only surmise the reason the Reverend Ball doesn't lend it to Harris is he maybe thinks it's a bad influence on a working class man. Because Byron's heroes are hugely affluent and affected, and maybe that was a perception that it would be healthy for him to have that kind of influence on his writing. But Harris isn't that emotive in his prose, but he describes himself as entranced, and he calls Byron a powerful magician. And I think that really shows you the extraordinary receptivity and sensitivity of Harris as a reader as well as a writer. So Harris goes on to, so Harris, all this time, Harris is down the mine, he's composing verses. And I thought to mention this to you, actually, because it's an interesting anecdote that people often get about Harris, and it's a really fascinating to know about him. So he basically is so poor that when he's composing his poetry, which obviously we're coming to his first attempt of being published, he's so poor that when he composes his poetry, he can't afford paper, and he can't afford ink. So he basically, a lot of his poems are composed orally and memorized, which in itself, if you look at any of his work, it's a feat. But secondly, his approach to having no ability to transcribe anything is that he basically talks about that he says he writes his poems on his nails of his hands. He scratches them on pieces of waste slate with a nail, and he uses blackberry juice and grocery bags to write his poems on. And again, it makes you think, doesn't it? In an era where you'll get junk mail and you'll throw it in the bin, or a flyer from the local kebab shop and you throw it in the bin, like, I don't want anything to do with that. And yet this is a man that was, paper was such commodity, and he was so poor that he had to basically, write on himself, write on junk that he found to try and, get a semblance recording this work. And this is a man that, in the end, by the end of his lifetime, publishes 15 extensive volumes of poetry. And that's extraordinary. So his first attempts at publication are kind of come from a religious sort of association, sort of. He puts his appearance. He puts a poem called First Primrose in a Methodist magazine, and through that he gets to know a man called Dr. George Smith. And Dr. George Smith is a local industrialist, and he used to live in a house in Campbell called Review, which still stands. George Smith is famous because, I think, and if I get this wrong, I know someone here will know better than me, but I always get a little bit mixed up. I think George Smith was involved in patenting the miner's safety fuse. So I don't think he invented it, but he supported it being patented, which made him a lot of money as he was also running a factory. And he basically is very affluent, George Smith, and he decides to support Harris. So we can find what he does here. Dr. George Smith of Camborne came to know me and kindly invited me to his house at Tribute. Tribute, like I said, does exist. This is all very. After one or two calls, I told him I should like to make an attempt at publishing, but I scarcely knew how to begin. The doctor paced his room and after a few turns said, "John, copy some of your best pieces and I'll submit them to my friends and see what they will say about it." This was done, and I anxiously waited to hear the verdicts of my judges. I've now forgotten all the others except that of Dr. Etheridge, who was a genuine classical scholar and a poet. He wrote to my patron to say, I would recommend The Love of Home and My Mother's Voice to the world. He encouraged the author, and he will take a stand among the English poets, which is high praise, I think. This was sufficient, and I was persuaded to collect enough pieces together to make an 18-penny volume. Now, I just want to actually, the 18-penny volume is actually Harris's biggest literary success. It's called Lays from the Mine, the Moor, and the Mountain, and it contains a series of poems mainly inspired by his work as a miner, and also with a heavily religious theme, quite pepper religious precepts, some poems about the local natural world, and some poems about a few local dignitaries, I think, possibly. And this edition of Harris's work is so popular that it sells out, and it's reprinted again in a second edition with more poems. So that's really one of Harris's biggest literary successes and the biggest print run. And I think we have to be fair here and acknowledge that a large chunk of Harris's success, I do believe passionately, evidently, that he's a very competent poet. But I also believe that Dr. George Smith is probably, I wouldn't quite say he's a Lennon to his McCartney because they're not writing together, but I think he facilitates Harris being successful. Harris's work is generally, well, Harris's work isn't generally, Harris's work is published using a model called the subscription model, which I don't know if anyone's aware of. I'll just quickly summarize so you can understand how important George Smith was to Harris. So George Smith basically would say, okay, there's this guy I know, he's a local miner, I think he's an excellent poet, and he's producing a poetry book. And George Smith would kind of write up like a kind of like a promotional kind of advert, we might call it, and just go around to people and say, how many copies would you like? And obviously George Smith is well off, he's well connected, and he has a lot of associates. And he basically, gets lots of people to subscribe to Harris's volume. And then obviously that helps sell it. And we'll come back to George Smith, but I think Harris's early literary success, I think Harris is an excellent poet, but his popularity is largely attributable to George Smith being so supportive of him and promoting his book and getting people to subscribe, because once they've got the list of subscribers, then they do the print run. It's kind of like pay on demand these days, I guess. So Harris, obviously, by all rights, could easily have died underground. And if you look at his poem Christian Heroism and other poems he writes, I think he writes a poem about the Hartley calamity as well. Harris's work is littered with tributes to those who die underground. And Harris, statistically, quite easily could have passed away. And if he hadn't passed away via just dying in an accident, he would have probably passed away just through exposure to what he was doing. But fortunately, Harris has a really fortunate turn of events. He's basically encouraged. Well, I'll read you the thing. I now began at my leisure to prepare pieces for a second volume. So Harris's first volume sells out, it's reprinted, he produces a second volume with extra poems. He then starts to work on a second volume. And a guy called Mr. Edward Bastin knocks on his door, and he basically offers him the job of scripture reader, so Bible reader, and that's required at Falmouth. And I think this is probably a very telling phrase. He acted kindly as a father, and at last procured the situation for me. So Harris lives in 7 Wellington Terrace in Falmouth, then at 6 Killigrew Terrace, and then at 85 Killigrew Road, and he spends the remainder of his life in Falmouth. He basically, there's not a line I've cited or quote I've cited here, but Harris talks an awful lot about how basically Mr. Edward Bastin saves his life, because if he spent much longer down the mine, he acknowledges it's likely he would have passed away. So the big thing after selling out your first volume of poetry and having it reprinted in a larger, longer, bigger edition is the fact that Harris is, and this is a true fact, the first working class or labouring class man to win the Shakespeare Tercentenary Prize. In 1863, by this point, Harris had published several volumes of poetry. He wins the prize. So let's read a little bit about it. The winning of the Tercentenary Prize happened thus. A rhyming friend of mine, Mr. W. Catcott, sent me an advertisement cut from a London journal, where I was offered the prize of a gold watch for the best poem on the 300th anniversary of the birth of Shakespeare. He advised me to compete for it. I consulted my wife about it, and she thought it would be well to try. Time passed, and I forgot the day of completion, going out at my Bible reading. When I came in, my wife called to me from the top of the stairs, "You have won the prize, the gold watch." And sure enough, there was a telegram asserting that I was a successful competitor out of upwards of 100. I was invited to Coventry to participate in a presentation, but that could not be. And if you were to Google this, a bit of detective work, there's some write-ups of this, and Harris doesn't go, he can't afford it. But it's a really big deal, and he wins this prize, and he's the first working class man to win it. And I think that's a significant literary achievement and an extraordinary thing. I think there's a lovely line. I'm going to misquote it, but he says something like, he talks about the arrival of the watch, and the postman brings it in. And he says something like, "I verily believe the little beauty has come." And he says something like, "Huzzah, the Cornish barbarians have won." And I quite like that, I quite like that notion that there's a sense that, a real win for the Cornish to win such a prestigious prize. These judges, I forget the exact name of one of the judges, but they are, the people that judge this prize are significantly academic people, and they just think it's a great poem. So I was just going to show you a little bit of it here. He sang of him the great, Shakespeare of kingly state, who in his boyhood by clear Avon strayed, learning the lore of song, from feeble thing and strong, the great tree towering and the tiny blade, the welkin's solemn height, the lightning's livid light, the thunder's mutter, the black whirlwind's roar, the little child at play, the redbreast on the spray, the daisy nodding by the ploughman's door, the hedges hung in flowers, the falling pattering showers, the dewdrops glittering in the morning shine, the smallest film that be, which none but poets see, all taught him lessons with a voice divine. And the voice divine is Harris referring to, obviously, Shakespeare. I think one of the biggest influences on Harris is Shakespeare. He uses him a lot, and there's bits where you can almost see the borrowing from Shakespeare in his own writing. And the poem itself is a longer piece. I mean, I think as a piece of work, if you were to ask me to evaluate it in the context of Harris's corpus, I would suggest that it is kind of essentially a piano, a tribute to Shakespeare, and there is more interesting work. But I think the fact that Harris wins this prize is a significant literary achievement, and it's really worth remarking upon when you think this is a guy who leaves school at the age of 9 and teaches himself to write poetry. So to look at sort of Harris's legacy in context, and I think, it's complex, isn't it, evaluating someone's legacy? But he won the Shakespeare Tercentenary Prize in 1863. He died in 1884, and he produced 15 volumes of poetry, and all of them achieved the attention of the national presses. And that's important to remember as well. Harris is a name, and he is reviewed. Literary periodicals like the Athenaeum, and they're a significant literary periodical of the 19th century, look at Harris's work and say, yeah, it's good. Part of the problem with this, and I talk about this a lot in my PhD, is that the praise tends to run along the lines of the slightly patronising, he's a good lad, isn't he? He's a miner, he's made himself literate, and he's written all these lovely poems about things, and he tells us that we should be respectful to each other and believe in God. And there's a kind of sense of, the reviews kind of read often like, oh, it's good for someone in his context. And you kind of know if you read reviews of other literary figures, these are sometimes engaged with the work much more formally. So Harris is kind of reviewed as a person, not as a poet, and that theme emerges. So although I'm pleased he receives the attention of the national literary periodicals, and it's typical of the time, I don't know if the reviews give us much insight. I think one of the reviews says, basically everyone should be more Harris. I mean, I'm being flippant and using everyday colloquialisms, but it kind of says like, he's an inspiration to us all because he's a God-fearing man who works out of mine, he writes poetry, isn't he great? But they don't talk about the work. And it's important to appreciate this is the case of several labor class poets, that are kind of really, really, really fated, and then they just disappear. I mean, Robert Bloomfield, who Harris was a large fan of, he wrote a poem called The Farmer's Boy, which was, extremely popular, incredibly popular. Like Bloomfield for a while was like a literary superstar, and then suddenly there's an issue with his publishers. He gets into debt. His wife has developed quite a severe mental illness. He becomes ill, I think. He becomes blind, and he's kind of he's this flash in the pan of attention, and then he just disappears from sight again. And I think this is a kind of common theme of working class poets because of this era, because they are kind of popular as a flavor of the month for a while, and then they stop being interesting, and so their reputation just diminishes, and people are like, who was that again? But they also reach these kind of quite stratospheric moments where they're really quite popular. And I think you can draw quite a few comparisons between Bloomfield and Harris there. Harris releases his first volume. It's a success. He wins a prize, and Bloomfield releases The Farmer's Boy. It's massively popular, and then suddenly everyone's like, "Who's Bloomfield again?" And he's just forgotten. And I think here, this is a fabulous thing. One of the things I discovered doing my research is you can write to the British Library, and they store all the applications to the Royal Literary Fund on file. So obviously I haven't got the originals, but they scan them for me and send them to me. And isn't this there's some exquisite 19th century handwriting here. This is John Harris's actual own handwriting. So a little thing, just to contextualize this. This is one of Harris's applications to the Royal Literary Fund. So the Royal Literary Fund is a place you can apply to as a writer to basically get money. And it started off as a very, 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 very sort of socialist enterprise. And the guy that first sort of wrote it was thought that even patronage was a form of subservience. But it eventually turns into basically this operation where you can subscribe, and if you publish some stuff, they'll give you some money. And Harris is known to them. He makes several applications. He gets a bit of money out of them every so often. And this is an application he's making to publish another collection. But I think when we're talking about Harris's sort of, to get a sense of Harris, this is an extract from his application for some money, and he's living in Falmouth at the time. You can see here he's at Killigrew Terrace, and he describes his personal circumstances a little bit there. You can see there, and he's sort of talks about his salary that he earns, £70 per annum. That sort of makes you think about inflation, doesn't it? When we talk about Rachel Reeves, and you can see here the dates. But what I find quite fascinating is my talk about Harris's legacy and his decline, really, or how successful he is throughout his career. If you look from Lays from the Mine, you can see that the print runs are there. 1,000, The Land's End, Kynance Cove, 1,000, The Mountain Prophet, 1,000, A Story of Cambrai, 1,000, An Ode on the Anniversary of William Shakespeare, which includes his prize-winning poem, 1,000, Shakespeare's Shrine, 1,000, and then we start dropping. Luda and Air the Druids, 750. Bula, Reuben Ross, A Tale of Manacles, 750. The Cruise of the Cutter, 500. And you start to see the amount of interest in Harris declining. Now, we can also attribute this to the fact that I think, and I need to double check this, but I'm fairly sure I'm right, just before Luda, Harris, Dr. George Smith, who was a massive supporter of Harris, passes away. And Harris says words to the effect of, it's a pain in the backside now, because Dr. George Smith was supporting me. He was, chasing people for the money for my book. He was making them subscribe to my collections. He was making them engage with my work. And Harris never finds anyone quite like George Smith again to be such an advocate of his work. And, we start to see a declining print run. So hopefully that was an interesting insight into the man. You might think, well, I want to see some of the poetry, and I hope you can appreciate that. I think the man, I was saying to Joni before we sort of all started talking, I think, to be honest, you could just do half an hour on the man, and he's fascinating. But I obviously am fundamentally interested in the poetry, and that's what I like to spend the rest of the time talking about. Harris's poetry is wide-ranging in both terms of theme and form. Okay, he is not just a poet. He wrote plays and he wrote short stories. He also wrote hymns. The topics of its poems range from mining to place. I say religious themes, but religious themes sort of inform everything Harris does. If Harris can get a religious precept in there, he'll get it in there. And that's partly because I think he has a deep and abiding faith, but I also think it's done to sometimes please his middle-class readership, if I'm being honest. And I just a few of these, and also the other thing Harris is very, very focused on is temperance. Harris devotes chunks of whole poetry collections to perils of alcohol. Harris is also a big promoter of world peace as well. The mining poems fundamentally feature in the first sort of half of Harris's corpus, and then after that, he kind of exhausts that, if you want to say that kind of mine. He doesn't write so much about it. Place features consistently throughout, and religious themes pepper most of his work. And the temperance work comes in the latter half of his corpus. And we tend to see, I think, a shift from Harris, where I think really about halfway through with his move to Falmouth, and some of the people he's associating with, like the publisher John Gill, who was a big, I think he's a vegetarian and a pacifist and a Quaker, and some of these people that Harris is associating with, he kind of starts aiming for a very broad sphere of influence, which I'm not sure he really achieved, but his attentions become much more global and much more noble maybe than they are. They're always noble, but they become very much, he talks in his later collections about wanting to elevate his race. And there's a kind of grandiosity to that, but there's also a kind of nobility to it. So I've obviously, if I was to go, and I don't have all the Harris collections, the Harris Society, I think Tony and Paula here do. If I was to sort of stack up the Harris collections, I don't know if you can see me very well on camera here, but I'd be looking like that. Yeah. So obviously there can only be a very, 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 very limited selection of poems I'm going to go through and talk to you about. And it's also worth knowing, and I'm happily contradicted by anybody, that though Harris wrote a lot of plays, I'm not aware of any of them ever being performed. I think they were just written for the pleasure of writing them and seeing them sort of read. So I wanted to start with a mine, because I think there's a kind of, I wouldn't say a split personality in Harris's writing, but there's when we talk about how accomplished he is, there's a real range of tone. And it kind of makes you sometimes wonder if it's the same person. So this is an extract from the poem Christian Heroism. And Christian Heroism basically deals with, amongst other things, that the biggest part of it is about two miners who basically lay a fuse, and they make a mistake, and they basically, one sacrifices himself to save the other, and the one that sacrifices himself by all rights should have been the one that saved himself. And he uses this really quite moving line. He says to he jumps in like a lift to escape this explosion. He leaves his partner there, and the one that's left says, "Escape, I shall be in heaven in a minute," which I think sort of sums up Harris. I think but a lot of his work is infused with the consolation, of religion as a way of dealing with a very challenging life. And in the Christian Heroism, I think Harris sort of addresses life underground. And I think this is a kind of wonderful piece of what I might term fantastical Gothic, really. And this is a very small extract. And I've read this several times in public, and I just think it's absolutely something quite evocative about it. Hast ever seen a mine? Hast ever been down in its fabled grottos, walled with gems and canopied with torrid mineral belts that blaze within the fiery orifice? Hast ever, by the glimmer of the lamp or the fast waning taper, gone down, down towards the earth's dread centre, where wise men have told us that the earthquake is conceived, and great Vesuvius hath his lava house, which burns and burns forever, shooting forth as from a fountain of eternal fire? And I think Harris, one of the reasons that Harris's reputation, I think, in academic circles, or I argued in my PhD, and I think I was occasionally maybe a little bit too forceful about that in reflection, is that one of the things that I'm going to generalize here a little bit, and it's important that this doesn't come across as lacking in nuance, but I kind of think that when you look at some mining poets who are popular, who have been reclaimed and had their reputation restored more quickly than Harris, you got someone like Joseph Skipsey. And I think Joseph Skipsey is a brilliant poet, but he's also very, very political. He's down a mine. He realizes he's being exploited. He's really angry about it. And he writes like that. He's like, this is totally unfair. And I think for academics and people, they kind of, there's a real sense of him being a working class or a labouring class firebrand. This is a man who's going down the pit. He's a collier, Joseph Skipsey. He's a northern collier, and he's angry. He's angry about it. It's not right. It's not fair. It's disgusting. He's being exploited. And, Harris kind of writes his stuff that's like, oh, well, it's tough, but, you die and you go to heaven, and it's not that Harris is glib, it's just pragmatic. And I think what sometimes gets overlooked is that it's still an implicitly, this kind of writing is still implicitly political. Because if you look at this, there's a series of rhetorical questions. Harris's readership would have been fundamentally middle class people who subscribed to his books and either chose to read them or didn't. And he asks these questions. He says, "Hast ever seen a mine? Hast ever been down its fabled grottos? Hast ever?" So he's challenging the reader. He's saying, "Have you ever experienced this?" And he goes on to really kind of emphasize his quite, emotive and quite fantastical Gothic terms, making use of that notion, that trope of the Gothic, how, it's not a nice place. Harris refuses to capitalize Earth. He kind of doesn't even credit it with being a part of planet Earth, and he calls it a dread center. He's implying it's like more of a hellish place, that it's a place reflective of God's work in creating the natural world, which is what Harris would have believed, obviously. But I think also, again, let's just remind ourselves, this is a man who leaves school at the age of 9, and you've got these allusions to Vesuvius and these notions, the Roman idea of genius, where you basically have the idea that there's a general divine nature present in every individual person, place, or thing. And for someone who left school before he was a teenager, to be making reference to some of these classical allusions and to be incorporating these ideas into a body of work when you left school at 9, you spend 13 hours a day down a mine, I just think it's extraordinary. But again, I'm saying that to you, and I'm footnoting myself, saying, but equally, obviously, the work is good in itself. So I'd like to juxtapose that with his introduction. So I've kind of gone backwards, but to make a point. So this is part of Harris's prose when he introduces the poem Christian Heroism. And if we just compare tones, it's kind of quite fascinating. So this is the introduction. And this is dealing with these two miners who lay a fuse and it goes wrong. And the one that should have, really escaped stays and sacrifices his life to save the other. And I just think, if we just look at these, I just find this, you look at this and you look at this, I think it's fascinating that this is the same man. Their proper course would have been to cut the fuse to its necessary length before placing it in the hole. Then one should have ascended the bucket, which is lifting them out of the shaft, and the other should have waited till the bucket came down again. Farther touch their place under the fuse, which would soon ignite it, given the signal, and so ascended to the top of the shaft before the explosion. In the present case, however, they negligently cut the fuse with a stone and one of their blunt iron drills. Fire was struck. The fuse was ignited. They both dashed to the bucket and gave the signal. The man above attempted in vain to move the windlass. One could escape, both could not, and delay was death to both. Listen to that pragmatism. It's just like, this is how it is. It is a general custom for the miner who attends to the charging of the hole to wait behind and fire it. It was our hero's turn to have ascended, and his comrade, who had charged the hole, should have remained behind and fired it. But looking for a moment at his mate and stepping from the bucket, he said, "Escape. I shall be in heaven in a minute." And I just sort of find that, this is someone, isn't it, who every day knows he's going to go down a mine, and there's a reasonable chance he won't come out again. And I find that kind of almost what I might call Gothic fantasy of this. This is like the range of voices that Harris accesses, and then the kind of pragmatic, well, this is how it would be, and then this is what happens, and then this happens, and then this person dies, essentially. I find that, it's a real range, and in itself, it kind of shows his value as well, as well as a poet. I think that Harris has some value as an historical chronicler of 19th century Cornish mining. I don't have enough industrial mining knowledge to be able to completely justify that statement, but he seems to write using quite a lot of specific terminology in quite a pragmatic way about mining processes. And I don't touch so much more on this in this presentation, but if you were to look at some poems that Harris writes, they're filled with glossaries and mining terms so people can understand what they're reading about. And that's quite a level of technical knowledge, that I think makes him also interesting in that way. In this poem particularly, he does provide a small glossary, but other poems, there's even more extensive glossaries and more extensive explanations. And so, we've got this real value, I think, for Harris, as an historical sort of document as well, of mining. So I think, though, the reason that I love Harris is I just think I think someone describes him. I forget who it is. It might be Paul Newman, and it might be one of his biographers. It's someone else calls Harris a sweet singer, and that sounds a bit naff, but he is. He's so mellifluent. He's so musical, and if we just read this, I think this is. I think someone else says it might be Don Thomas or it might be Paul Newman. Harris is great on weather. I think this is cracking. This is from a long poem that Don Thomas. Just quickly, if you don't know who Don Thomas is, he's I would say relatively famous. Well, he is famous, really. Cornish poet first. I think Don would be unhappy if I said he wasn't a poet first. Poet and novelist. His most famous book is The White Hotel, which you may well have heard of. And Don, we'll get to it later. Don produces an excellently, very thoughtful introduction, selected works of John Harris in 1977, and Don thinks this poem, A Story of Cambrai, is Harris's masterpiece. And it's kind of hard to explain it to you without taking about half an hour and using the rest of my time, but it's essentially a poem that begins with two horsemen riding up Cambrai in appalling weather. They go to a woman's house and they sort of tell all these different stories to each other that cover a diverse range of topics. It's like a Chinese box narrative. But the opening, I just think, is cracking. I'm just going to read it to you and we'll talk about why I think it's so good. Still onward dashed the horsemen. Through the mist loomed the grey granite crags and castle top of mineral mark Cambrai, whose awful head was drenched with rain and pitted with the storm. The rabbit cowered within its mossy cell. The wild bird sat in silence neath the lead with half-shut eye and beak beneath its wing and talons sunk into the sodden mould. As marched the winds across the horrid wild, hurling the raindrops on the groaning world. Still onward dashed the horsemen, bank and briar and deep morass and ditch with water drowned, and lanes where ruts yawned hungry, and dark pits whose open mouths led into treacherous mines, and rivers wildly tumbling over their brims, and ruins green with age or grey with years, and bogs with torture boiling, all were past. And in a cottage clinging to a rock where sat a lonely dame in linen weeds, they turned at last for shelter, where their steeds smoked in an outhouse beneath a roof of straw. I mean, you know, such a skillful use of plosives, you know, it's just got, and then you've got this personification, you know, the whole of the whole of Cambrai, you know, it's awful. The lanes yawn hungry. Cambrai is like an awful head, and that long vowel sound of the A, you know, when I love about Harris is he makes you read him. You when you hear him, you can tell this is a man that composes this stuff orally. And in the musicality of it, and you know, and the pace of it, you know, whenever I read Harris, I have to just sort of wind my neck in and slow myself down because I want to keep going faster and faster and faster. There's this energy to it that propels you along with the work. So another thing that I wanted to touch on was the diversity of themes in Harris's work. So and in sometimes, I think sometimes possibly the variety of themes is almost bewildering. I mean, he covers so many topics. And one thing he talks about, and it's kind of one of my sort of, it's a bit of a curate's egg really, but I love it. And I know other sort of Harris scholars and fans, I don't know, Dr. Alan Kent is obviously not here with us anymore, really loves this poem too, he talks, this poem here, Luda and Other Druids, is basically a poem about many things, but he basically takes Cambrai and he massively romanticizes this place as a site of a massive battle. And not content with, you know, using like Mount Cambrai as this site of a massive battle between two warring sort of pagan tribes, Harris also decides to include a bit of druid sacrifices to spice things up a little bit more melodrama, a bit more, is it quite the Gothic? I don't know. And I kind of, when I first read it, I was kind of like, what's he doing here? And then I did a bit of research, and I think partly Harris, and he talks about it extensively in his notes. He kind of does a set of notes to this. He was particularly inspired by William Borlase's, might get the title wrong, The Antiquities of Cornwall or something like that. And William Borlase went to the top of Cambrai and found grooves in the rocks or holes in the rocks and thought they were evidence of druid sacrifice. And I believe, and again, if I'm wrong, I'm happily contradicted, that this has been proved to be utterly unsubstantiated. from my reading of the Druids, and I think from a limited reading of Ronald Hutton and stuff, I'm under the impression we know very little about the Druids because they didn't write anything down. So this is a very fantastical exercise. But I think what goes on here is that Harris is kind of really using the Druids as a kind of way of saying, as a very religious man with a very strong faith, that pre-Christian religion was not good. We just read this. I think it's quite a fun bit of fantastical sort of melodrama. So this describes a Druid sacrifice which sort of occurs slightly haphazardly halfway through the poem. Oak leaves upon the altar lie, and sprinkled is the holy ground, while the assembly wait around. Some naked forms are standing there with paint upon their bodies bare. The Druid's prayer is now begun. Turning his body to the sun, he walks around the excited throng, his thick beard streaming white and long. So we've got some, we've got some cliches here, I think. The fated victim's hour is come. The trumpet clangs and sounds the drum. Shake the horrocks and bows the wood. Full 50 arrows drink his blood. The altar fire flames up the sky, and the straw image blazes high. Intemperance howls of hideous roar. Thank heaven, these rites will rage no more. So there's a really melodramatic quality to this, and I think Harris's work is generally lacking in melodrama. But I do think that the scholar John Goodrich makes some good points about the fact that actually, it's very easy to take a kind of sniffy attitude towards melodrama. But actually, it does have the power to convey the drama of social individual crisis. And I think for Harris, like he's a very, very deep and abiding faith. He's a big believer in peace and a lack of violence. And I think for him, pre-Christian religion is characterized by violence, and he has a kind of horror of it, a kind of horror of this notion of Druid sacrifice. And any kind of potentially return to that kind of primitivism which he perceives, and I think it's quite an interesting poem to view in that context as well. I mean, you might feel it's it bears elements of cliche, but there is a melodramatic quality which I think for Harris is quite genuine. I think he truly believes like Christian values are the way to live a very, very good life, which he has in common with a large amount of the UK in the 19th century. Obviously, people like Percy Shelley saying that atheism was a necessity are real outliers. Most people have a deep and abiding faith, and I think Harris uses these sort of tropes of like Druidry to sort of just show how important he thinks that the Christian religion is to people. So another big sort of chunk of Harris's work is focused on temperance. Now, temperance for a while, when I was presenting at conferences about 5 years ago, was quite a hot topic in academic circles, I think. You've got, I'm going to get this, what's she called? She wrote East Lynne, and before that something else, and I can't remember her name. But there's a woman who wrote a lot of temperance novels. Temperance, of course, can mean very, very many things. Temperance can mean moderation with alcohol, and it can also, I think, be coded as meaning complete abstinence. For Harris, it means complete abstinence, and a large chunk of his work is kind of really devoted to saying just don't drink. And I think that's really informed by, he talks about it in his autobiography, actually. It's really informed by the fact that he just sees so many people who are struggling in difficult circumstances, in really difficult jobs, working as miners, using alcohol as a form of crutch, and it really ruining their lives, and it making people deeply unproductive. And I can't quote it verbatim, but there's a great anecdote in his autobiography where he sort of says, I went to the pub, I thought I'll get drunk, and I looked round and thought, if I do this, this is my life and I won't be productive. And I left and I told myself I would never drink. And, to be as productive as Harris is, there's not room for, there's not room for substance abuse, there's not room for that at all. There's the time needs to be spent working. And it is very, there's also, but then also you hit there on another reason why Harris appeals to some people, because he's an advocate for temperance, and a drunk labouring man is not a useful wet labouring man. So Harris is also seen to be a good role model to his peers, which is why I think a lot of this work gets produced, because he's also seen as a really good role model. He's been there and he's saying, no, look, you don't drink, you don't do that. So this is a poem from not a poem at all, that's absolutely not true. This is an excerpt from a play called Caleb Cliff. Harris loves a good literature title. Oh, sorry, say it more slowly. Harris loves a good alliterative title. Caleb Cliff is probably symbolic because it deals with a man called Caleb who works, I think, as a logger on the moor. He starts to drink. He's unable to maintain. He becomes an alcoholic, essentially. The poem deals with Caleb reaching a kind of rock bottom, repenting, and as a kind of, like, I don't know what you might call it, a kind of divine reward for his repentance, he becomes a successful businessman and very affluent. And Harris says that that was based on a real life person that he knew. I don't know who that was. I've never found that out. But the poem Caleb Cliff really sort of makes extensive use of various sort of speech patterns. And I'm realizing now that I could be getting a bit too under the bonnet because I'm really interested in prosody. And if people ask what prosody means, I mean the way that poems use various arrangements of syllable counts with various emphases to create certain impacts on how they sound and how they might affect us. And so this is a small extract from the play Caleb Cliff. And in this small extract, Caleb Cliff is singing a song while he's drunk. And there's this wandering traveler who's trying to kind of show him the path of righteousness and say, you need to not get drunk, you need to be responsible to your family, you need to stop drinking. And at this point in the play, Caleb, who is not repentant at all, he's utterly defiant. And he's like, no, I'm just going to get drunk. I don't care. I'm enjoying myself. And I think when we sort of, again, I go back to it, but when we think about Harris being this person that from the age of 9, has left school, and we look at what he starts to do in this extract from Caleb Cliff, he's just singing. The character Caleb is singing, and he's drunk, and he says, "Fill the tankard foaming o'er, for I love it more and more. I will drink till blinks the day, I will drink while parsons pray. Fill the foaming tankard, fill, for I'm thirsty, thirsty still. I will drink while misers snore, and then I'll tumble on the floor." And, this is someone who's just defiantly going to, he's like, I'm drunk, I love it, I've got no intention of being repentant, I don't care. And what I've studied Harris's body of work closely is I think what people don't realize is that Harris uses a wide range of metrical schemes. And as I said, metrical schemes are really when you organize your lines into a certain number of syllables, place emphasis on some syllables and not others. And that the Victorians passionately believed had a real influence on what the poem communicated to us on an emotional level. So I'm just going to try and explain this. I hope I don't get too technical and bore people too much. But if you read Kirsty Blair's Culture of the Heart or Jason Rudy's Electric Meters, the Victorians had a kind of idea that where the stresses and emphases were placed in a poem, it had what they might call a kinetic effect on the body. And Kirsty Blair cites the example of a lady who suffers from arrhythmia, and she goes to church to listen to the hymns, and she just finds the melody and the rhythm of the hymns soothes her, and just the sound regulates her. Obviously, if you know anything about your Shakespeare, you'll know that Shakespeare is primarily, and many other writers of that era, and just like before and post, write in iambic pentameter, which sort of imitates the sound of the heartbeat. So it kind of goes da-dum, 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 da-dum. And much of Caleb Cliff, this play that Harris writes, is in tribute to Shakespeare, written in this standard metrical form of iambic pentameter, where you've got the unstressed, the stressed, the unstressed, the stressed, and it imitates the sound of the human heartbeat. And it also obviously mimics the natural rhythms of English speech. Now, I won't read all that to you. If you read it, you read it. And if you don't have to, it's probably a bit too much on reflection. But what's interesting is most of this play, when the standard characters are speaking and they're not drunk, and when Caleb's not drunk, he speaks in his iambic pentameter. His speech pattern goes da-dum, 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 da-dum. But in the bits where he's drunk, Harris reverses the beat. And so rather than going da-dum, it goes dum-da. And this is called, super technical phrase alert, catalectic trochaic tetrameter, which basically means a reverse of the iambic pentameter. And so rather than going da-dum, 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 it goes dum-da, dum-da, dum-da. And so the kind of melody is off. It sounds wrong. And if you've ever heard of that phrase before, you might have done, it's something used by Shakespeare it's something used by Shakespeare, particularly the witches' speeches. The catalectic bit means it drops a syllable, so it should go dum da dum da dum da dum da, but it actually goes it drops the last da. But I think that what Harris is doing there, and this might sound like a bit of a flight of fantasy, but he knows his stuff enough to be doing this. I think he really thinks being drunk is a really bad idea, and even possibly like a fiendish kind of satanic kind of thing to do. It's just a really bad idea. And so when he starts writing using these metrical schemes, which like reference the witches in Macbeth, or they sound wrong compared with a regular beat like pentameter, he's kind of trying to jar or shock his audience if this play were to be performed. He's trying to have a kind of physical impact on them. When I'm explaining it, sometimes I try and say it's like I'm adopting a kind of voice of like a really bad Transylvanian accent to try and play Dracula. You know, you're trying to give a different sense of something. And I think, you know, to be thinking about poetry, to be thinking about playwriting, and to be thinking about language in that way with so little formal erudition is just extraordinary. So, and then if we look here, this is another speech which follows a much more clear iambic pattern with these emotive images, you know. So first he's drunk here and now he's sober, and he says, since I came here a melancholy man, this is Caleb Cliff, he's now reformed, he's a sober man, with grief enough upon my wretched shelf to cover a mountain. Know you not that men look to me as a blazing ship rushing to ruin? You know, what beautiful imagery as well. Hurried by the storm, the great disposer saved me. Through the masts and sails and spars, flames the water's edge, thank God, by one great effort I escaped and leaped upon the rock of temperance. And does someone turn the microphone off, please? I can't. Yeah. And so was saved. I, who before was steeped so deep in sin that I sank down below the strong horn brew. And I ask you why, my friends. So here we've got a example of that contrast between that dum da pattern and that da dum pattern. But I also think you've got some, yeah. And again, I think Harris is really good with imagery as well. You know you not that men looked at me as a blazing ship rushing to ruin, hurried by the storm. What a cracking extended metaphor, you know. And again, it's this sort of feel he's got that I just think is great. And the reason that I think this juxtaposition between different forms of writing is it shows different moods and different states. So we see this drunk Caleb Cliff in Act 1 of Harris's play, who's unrepentant, doesn't care about his family, just wants to be drunk all the time, thinks it's funny, and then suddenly he's able to be like, oh no, this was wrong, and he's regulated, and he's in a regulated metrical form with a regulated rhythm, and that kind of nuance I think is just fascinating. I'm not necessarily making the grand claim that Harris thinks quite in these terms, but I think there's an instinctiveness in his writing that is, and there's a musicality to it that really achieves that. So my sort of final piece on technical sophistication is that I mean he's biased, isn't he? But his son, John Harris's son, John Harris's son is a bit of a tongue twister. John Howard Harris writes his biography. A bit bizarre because Harris has already written his autobiography and his son decides I'll rewrite it for him, or I'll rewrite my version of it, and my dad's famous, I guess he's thinking. And he says about he says his dad is something like, he talks about how accomplished his dad is formally, how skillful he is with various forms of you know, like various forms of meter. And but I think, you know, there really is a musical ear to what Harris does. If we look at this short extract from Bulow, which is another play Harris wrote, it's quite a complicated narrative about a sort of shipwrecked traveller who falls in love with someone, they end up in Australia. It's quite complicated, but if we just look at the two extracts just as pieces of work, and this is some two pieces of dialogue. And still this knocking. What intruder scares the dark-winged night and hurries sleep away, where torrents lift their voices and the bat sports with the moonbeams in the old church lane beside the woodman's cottage? Bulow up. And you know, here you've got this, like these small subtle details which I just think are just so well judged. Like, you know, Harris places a stress on lift and bat, yeah, because obviously that's what he's trying to emphasize. And you know, they're imitative of lift and the flight of the bat, they go up. Or here, he says, our bark rose like a feather on the foam, and then sank down into the horrid depths, and thus we drifted, losing all command. The mighty winds being master, soon the helm broke, and the creaking mast crashed overboard. Lost, cried the captain, and the face of death frowned in the flashing foam. We had with us a lovely maiden from another isle, whose tale of love was passing pitiful. And for me, I don't know anyone else, that reminds me so much of that line in it's a shipwreck he's describing there, obviously our bark being the boat, and that's the opening of Bula. There's a shipwreck and a traveller arrives at the coast, and that reminds me so much of the opening of The Tempest, but he does something different with it. But again, you know, like if you look at this simile, like a feather on the foam, it combines stressed and unstressed syllables. Feather, to kind of connote that directionless notion of the bark. And you know, and it's loads of fricatives, like he talks about the flashing foam, and there's this sort of energy to it, and this judgment that I think is just so nuanced, and I think it's partly instinctive and partly deliberate, if I'm honest. It's just such a musical ear he's got, and I just think that what's quite sad to draw this sort of section on Harris's technical work together is that he's really skilled, and there's lots that he does which is quite merit-worthy and quite well judged. But when we read a review of Harris, and I haven't included any in this presentation, they're just kind of like, oh, it's good that he's a miner. It's good that he's such a good person, and he says we should just be religious and be faithful and do all these things and work hard. And no one just engages with some of the work on a technical level. And that's what I've tried to address, obviously, with my PhD. But I guess sort of coming to the closing part of this presentation, and if you're still there, thank you for staying with me. I hope it was interesting. So the question, and Joni asked this, so why have I never heard of him? And it's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Everyone knows who R.S. Hawker is, I would say. Everyone knows who Jack Clemmo is, and that Luke Thompson's done some really important work, if you didn't know who he was. Everyone knows who Charles Causley is. I mean, he was Niddy Poet Laureate, I believe. A lot of people know who Don Thomas is. And The White Hotel was an incredibly famous book in its time. And most people know who Nick Dark is. And Quilla Cooch, people know who he is. Some, and we've got the Q Fund. But if you Google Cornish writers, you're more likely to get Patrick Gale come up, or someone, not dismissing Patrick Gale, or someone who sets their work in Cornwall, or somebody who, you know, like, he's just not known by hardly, you know, by enough people, and I sort of don't really know why. I mean, I've got some theories as to why, and I'll talk about them a little bit, but and obviously there's some excellent work done with the John Harris Society, who really spend a lot of their time very tirelessly in varying different contexts promoting Harris's work and legacy. But it just seems that there's this great big gap. You know, we've got sort of, to me, you know, really, if you're going from the sort of, you know, 19th century, you know, why is Harris not there? You know, it should be surely, and people talk about Harris. I mean, like Causley references him in the Times Literary Supplement and talks about how great he is, but he just doesn't seem to catch fire anywhere. You know, and I think that's the main reason why I've done the work I've done, because I just feel like someone needs to give him that attention. It's important to acknowledge that Don Thomas there has produced a selected works of John Harris in 1977 called Songs of the Earth, which contains a very astute introduction to Harris's body of work. If I was to offer Don one criticism, and I hope he would take it in spirit, is that due to constraints of space, he does chop up a lot of poems into quite small sections, and you get to read some really exciting bits, but you also don't view them in the whole context, which I think is a bit of a shame. And I feel that that's something that I'm not sure I wish there could be more of it. One of the reasons that I mean, this is just one little thread. I mean, it's really hard to work it out. I mean, I think one of the reasons Harris disappears is lots and lots, to be blunt, lots and lots of working class or labouring class Victorian poets disappear. You know, the working class poet is a late 18th century, 19th century phenomenon. Before people like Harris and Robert Bloomfield in the 19th century, you've got people like Stephen Duck. I think that's right. And these late 18th century kind of working class poets. And then it comes into 19th century. And then you get Robert Southey writing his book about, you know, what he calls the uneducated poets, which surely is a contradiction in terms to a certain extent. But anyway, and, you know, I think what it comes down to is these people are a curate's egg. They're a curiosity. They sell a few books. They're interesting for a while. And then people's interest, like anything else, just wanes. But obviously, I'm sat here talking to you and you're listening, and I believe Harris is important and we should care about him. I think, and I don't know if this is necessarily in any way we can ascribe this to a lack of critical interest in Harris until this sort of late 1970s. But I think this is quite telling in itself. This is what so this is Sabine Baring-Gould. You may know Sabine Baring-Gould because I think he wrote the hymn Onward Christian Soldiers. He was a well, it says here, he was an antiquarian, a hagiographer, a folk song collector, and an eclectic scholar. Sabine Baring-Gould absolutely hates John Harris. And he writes this book in 1909 called Cornish Characters and Strange Events. And in it, he essentially writes this, and this is referring to Harris. He says, a set of verses without ideas may be pleasant verses, but it's not poetry. And without ideas and without imagination is very poor stuff indeed. John Harris could write smooth lines. He had a tender appreciation of the beauties of nature, but he went no further. His verses bear the same relation to poetry that Tupper's proverbial philosophy bears to the philosophy of Plato. So pretty damning. And I don't know that we can sort of, and I find that quite interesting because obviously Baring-Gould sort of overlaps with Harris. This Cornish Characters of Strange Events book is a kind of like a hodgepodge of where Sabine Baring-Gould kind of offers a bit of an evaluation of the Cornish artistic scene and a few significant Cornish features, and it contains various entries. But what you're kind of left with is like a really, I mean, Sabine Baring-Gould sort of fits into a different class bracket than Harris. He's more advantaged, he's better off. And you just get this sense that he kind of views Harris's work with this really withering contempt. You know, he kind of thinks that basically he's pretentious, melodramatic, and a bit thick. And I think that's the only bit of critical treatment that Harris gets until really Don produces Songs of the Earth in 1977. You know, there's not really anyone pays any attention to him. And, you know, if you're looking, not that anyone particularly referred to Sabine Baring-Gould when they make a decision about whether they wanted to investigate the works of John Harris, but it kind of shows you receive this dismissal, and then after that, it's just nothing. There's no restoration of a reputation. There's no interest in him. And today, I can, you know, literally count on one hand, or in less than, I don't even need a whole hand, the amount of scholarly articles on John Harris's work. But so I'd like to conclude, I suppose, by talking about why John Harris, I think, is important and why we should care about him. And I think that I'm not the first person to do this. Obviously, you've got you've got Songs of the Earth by Don Thomas in 1977, which is obviously out of print, but you can buy a copy online. It's an excellent introduction to Harris and his work, and a very good summary of some of the stronger pieces of the strongest work. It's a real best of, you know. You've then got David Everett's done some work, and that I think is still available somewhere, but it's a similar thing. Obviously, the Harris Society have produced The Extinguished Candle Relit, which you can buy from their website, and that's another really interesting selection, often the shorter poems, a really diverse blend of stuff, which gives you another sense of the man rather than the one I've given you today. I think in summary, probably, the breadth and depth of Harris's subject matter, as well as his skillful use of a wide range of poetic forms, make him a noteworthy poet. And I think he's enjoyable to read. I think he's worthy of study, and he's deeply reflective of Cornish context and much overlooked. And I also think, unlike other mining poets, like Joseph Skipsey, who is not like, you know, I think Joseph Skipsey is brilliant. It's just a different kind of thing. I think there's a huge fidelity to 19th century mining processes, and he's also, you know, a really important historical document. So if I have piqued your interest rather than put you to sleep, you might want to think about the books I've mentioned. In the spring of this year, I'm putting out a book called The Trick of the Bard, which the Mining World Heritage have kindly supported. And I will, if anyone's interested in that, they can email me and I'll let you know some information about it when it comes out. It's coming out of Francis Bootle. We intend to produce initially the plan was a collected, and then we realized that it would be so expensive and so unwieldy that A, probably no one would buy it, and B, you would probably need a forklift to deliver it to your house. So we've now gone for a very extensive selected, and our plan, or the plan is to produce a really extensive selected poems, which will give you the biggest range of Harris's work that you can get, with a scholarly introduction, which obviously I've written, I've edited the collection. And I hope that that's something that, you know, people who come to this and his interest is piqued will kind of contact me, send me your email, let me know, or drop it in the chat, and I can sort of let you know when that book's coming out. We'll be doing a proper launch for it, and I'm really, really excited. So the big question mark is because I've finished, and are there any questions, really? Is everyone still there?
Yes. Sorry, I was just unmuting. I was just popping some stuff in the chat. So in the chat, I've put in a link to the sign up for the Institute of Cornish Studies mailing list. We do regular monthly newsletters, and we will definitely be doing a little profile or letting you know when Duncan's book comes out, because I mean, this is brilliant. First of all, apologies for my camera off. I've got slightly unstable internet connection, so yeah, that's why that is. I just want to say an absolutely enormous thank you, Duncan. That was brilliant and completely fascinating. So many questions. There's been a whole bunch of conversation in the chat. A bunch of people, a couple of people being like, you know, wonderful, thanks, Duncan, very informative, and all of this kind of stuff. And I can absolutely see why. We don't have a huge amount of time, and maybe we might, I don't know if you'll be okay to flex, you know, maybe have like 5 minutes after, you know, 5 minutes after the time that we've got scheduled. But excuse me, I'm just kind of running through some of the chat questions. And there's a bit of discussion about Methodism and maybe the influence that would have had on some of, you know, on his some of his attitudes and views. And I was also wondering about the kind of like philanthropic improvement part of Methodism as well. And a bit of Mike O'Connor notes that Harris received £200 from the Royal Bounty Fund in 1877 and 100 from the Civil List by Gladstone in 1881. So he was kind of like just kind of trying to push you a little bit on the idea of declining recognition.
Yeah, so I would say, so I did some research into this, and the Royal Bounty Fund is rather mysterious as to why you get money from it. And I believe, and I'm now trying to remember my own research, which is a year ago, I believe the Royal Bounty Fund is kind of given at the, Tony Blair wrapped it up not that long ago. And I believe it was kind of given out for services to the government. Which is oblique as it sounds, and I in my thesis speculated that Harris did a lot of work on common land, and a lot of work. He did an extensive load of short story writing for a lot of newspaper presses, and he dealt with what's called the land question, about how common land was being appropriated and reused, and a lot of what he was saying was in line with governmental policy. And the impression I was left with, but it was totally speculative, was that a lot of his writing was done to sort of advocate certain government policies, and that's why he got the money from the Royal Bounty Fund. It was almost like a payment for some work which promoted certain political viewpoints. But that is quite complicated. The Civil List pension, I can see what you're saying. I think, I mean, it's important not to then like defend myself by quoting someone else. If you read The Meads of Love by Paul Newman, which is a great way, if you don't want to read Harris's own autobiography, you can read, it's on the internet, it's not too expensive to get hold of a copy. Paul Newman's Meads of Love tends to kind of like, Paul Newman is of a similar viewpoint to me, that Harris's real sort of flair, real moment of success kind of ends with the Tercentenary Prize. His subscriptions drop. And I think the poems are good, but as a reader, I prefer the first half of Harris's corpus to the second half. So when I talk about decline, I suppose I'm talking about a falling subscription rate, which we see, and I'm talking possibly about maybe even the quality of the work, for me, not being quite as strong in the last 3 or 4 volumes, which I didn't really touch on so much in this presentation. But that's just my perception.
Nice one, thank you. Somebody, so Freya Campbell asks, was Harris still writing at a time when awful had a neutral connotation, or had that passed by then?
So I need to get out my a big old dictionary and be definitely sure. I mean, I mean, I think that I kind of took it as meaning in my interpretation of it that awful was awful, but it's full of awe. But I would really should have looked up the etymology of the word in context to justify that supposition. So I think that's a fair question to ask.
Actually, it's fascinating, isn't it? I'm just making me think about the way that words change meanings and
Well,
how.
yeah, and yeah, hugely. So I mean, and there's people here in the chat I can see that I've challenged in a really constructive way, and I really welcome it. Some of the academics, some of the arguments I made, which are maybe are maybe too much for a stretch, but you sort of find with Harris that lots is quite possible. He kind of he's yeah.
Cool. And Jane Wills asks, could Harris be talking about Carnbray in West Penwith from where you can see Land's End? There's an old ruin up that hill too, and it has sacred connotations.
Yeah, quite possibly. I mean, I think what I was using that was as indicative of Harris's general. If you read the introduction to Songs of the Earth, Don Thomas talks an awful lot about like the Harris and how he tends to romanticize the natural environment. And to me, though it could well be he was describing a specific vantage point, there's a big romanticization project at work with Harris. He describes places in ways that I don't recognize them. And I think that, and that's partly because it's a different era, but I also think that he kind of renders a natural world in a very romantic way with a capital R.
Nice one, thank you. So I'm firing questions at you,
Yeah,
but
that's okay.
so this is from Georgina Trelaws. This isn't a question, this is a comment, but I think you might like it, especially because you're talking such a lot about how he provides, he talks about mining. And
Yeah.
Georgina says, thank you, Duncan. My Cornish ancestors left for Australia at Harris's time. And the writing of his that you shared is a great window into their world, which I'm learning more about each day. I think that's a really nice point, actually.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I mean, and there's a lot of Harris's work. I think it's quite wide ranging. I mean, his first collection, there's a whole poem about like Red Indians in it. Yeah, he does kind of have a very expansive range of topics that he touches upon, and it's really interesting. He does touch on the diaspora as well a little bit in places. He's very, I think he's very wide ranging, and the topics are really, really quite broad.
Fascinating. And I'm also I personally was really struck when you were talking about Cambrai and the Folly Castle on top of Cambrai. And I think it's now quite an expensive restaurant, but they do some really nice food up there.
Yeah.
I
Did
don't
you
know.
know the guy that runs it is related to Judith Sawalha? Did you know that?
Okay.
So he's some relative of Judith Sawalha, the actress, and absolutely fabulous.
My goodness, I had no idea about that.
Yeah. I don't know what exactly. So if someone knows better than me, they can put it in the chat, but I'm sure there's a relationship there. But yes, I've eaten there myself. It's a beautiful spot, isn't it?
Yeah, very definitely. And I can definitely see why you found it quite evocative. Um, should we do a final question from Mike O'Connor? And he says, Harris is perhaps at his best when situating his work in the Cornish landscape. Could this have given Baring Gould and others an impression of parochiality?
Yeah, I'm just reading it. Sorry, I'm just.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. I didn't quote all the Baring Gould. I think he does think Harris is parochial, but I think he also thinks that Harris is massively pretentious. He talks about him. He talks about him being, and I didn't quote all this, being wildly melodramatic. He says that John Harris clearly thought he was born for better things. So he clearly thinks that Harris's aspiration to be a poet and he thinks the way that Harris writes in such an affected way, which I think has connotations of romanticism. I think the right word is Baring Gould, if you read it, and I'll be interested in your opinion, finds it pretty repulsive. You know, the only thing he likes about Harris is when he writes in what he calls plain speech about simple facts in his life. He thinks anything else is just a pretentious elevation of a working man who couldn't aspire to such fine feeling. That's what I'm left with Baring Gould. So yes, he probably does think Harris is parochial, but I also think he thinks that he's a pretentious idiot, really, and can't write well, aspires to write well, thinks he's born for better things, thinks he's this literary figure that he's not, and views him with a fairly intense contempt.
Do you think, are there connotations about like this guy who got above his station in there?
Yeah, hugely. I mean, I argue my PhD, and it's if anyone wants to read it, and you know they want to, it's online. You just Google it; it's there. Visions of Calm Bray, it's called. I basically say that I think that Baring Gould's big beef with him is that he's just simply it's not that simple, but it's class-based criticism. You know, he basically thinks this is a working man. What does he know? How, you know, and like he finds it just affected and ridiculous and melodramatic and silly. You know, but if you look at someone like Shelley, I mean, I don't think, you know, that will be fine, I guess, because he's posh enough to be able to write like that. I don't know.
Wow. I feel like you have given us such a lot to think about.